We all know that the Americas used to be completely controlled by Europe, from Argentina in the south to Greenland in the north. At one point, it was all in the hands of Europeans, and we know that today it is independent. But most people don't know how it became independent. The only real exception to this is the US War of Independence, which has been covered by like a million documentaries and YouTube videos. But in this video, we will cover all of the Americas, not just the USA. We will discuss the general reasons why a colony wants to become independent, and then look at the individual countries. And we will talk about every single colony. Chapter 1. Control of the homeland over its colonies. The first reason why a colony might demand independence from the homeland is because that homeland wants more control over that colony. To understand this, we need to look at how Europeans colonized the Americas, because in general, the homeland had very little control. Europe and America were very far apart. Because of this distance, it was difficult to control your colonies. For example, it could take months just to send a letter. So if you made a law today, the colony would only know about it months later. So European kings and queens would assign governors. These governors ruled the colony mostly independently, and they would receive general orders from Europe, but the governor decided how to implement the specifics. And for centuries, this low level of control worked just fine. The reason for this is that when an empire does well, the homeland wants less control. Because if everything is going great, then changing that system might do more harm than good. And for a long time, the American colonies prospered. The empire was earning a lot of money from trade, more people moved to the colonies to set up new and unique industries, and the militaries of these empires became some of the largest in the world. There was no need to involve themselves more with the colonies when those colonies are helping the empire prosper. So why change this system? Well, these good times ended in one of the largest wars in history, the 7 Years' War. It took place between 1756 and 1763 and was the first global war. It was fought on every continent except Antarctica and Australia. What is important for the decolonization of the Americas is that this war started in North America, when a British officer led a group of soldiers to attack the French. And at the end of this war, the British had a massive debt. And in order to pay that debt, the British would need to raise taxes. All of a sudden, the British Empire stopped prospering under the weight of this massive debt. And when an empire starts doing poorly, they will try to take more control of the government in order to fix the problem. For example, let's say that right now you are in charge of a country that has massive debt. You want to raise 10% taxes on everybody's income. To do this, you need to know how much people earn. And for this, you need control over the banks, company finances, and have a police force able to arrest anyone who doesn't pay their taxes. This requires a lot of control. So if a government wants to fix a large issue, it needs to have a large amount of control. So just to sum things up, in general, when things are great, governments tend to have less control. When things are bad, governments take more control. And in the case of the British, they tried to tax their colonies in the Americas. After all, they started the war, we had to protect you guys, so you should pay us back for that protection. But every time the British actually tried to take more control, the colonies resisted. The British would levy one tax and then the colonies would fight the British on it until eventually they came up with a different tax. And then the colonies fought them on that too, until eventually the conflict became a war of independence in 1776. It did so for many reasons. Some were afraid that the British might free the slaves and thus harm the wealth of the slave owners. Some wanted democratic government, others did it for personal freedoms. But in the end, all the reasons simply came down to the fact that they were generally fine living in the British Empire until that empire tried to take more control over the colonies. And the USA isn't the only American country that gained their independence for this reason. Another example is Canada. A lot of people loyal to the British government moved north to Canada. All of a sudden, Canada became a lot more pro-British, and instead of fighting for independence, the Canadians were fighting for reforms. Instead of wanting less control, they wanted more control. You see, the Canadian governments were corrupt. The people wanted this corruption to end. They wanted a government where corrupt politicians would be replaced with good politicians. And after two failed uprisings, the British finally listened. In 1840, they merged the various Canadian governments into a single centralized government. And this central government would become more and more powerful as Canada as a nation became more and more important. Its economy grew, its population grew, and its military grew. And Great Britain wanted more control over these important parts of Canada. But Canada listened to rule of acquisition number 125. You can't make a deal if you're dead. Instead of fighting a war against the British, like the USA, they would make a deal with the British. The British would keep access to Canadian trade, it would keep Canada as a military ally, and it would keep dictating various laws to Canada, while the Canadians would get to rule their own country. The British were basically giving up all the costs while keeping all the benefits. And so, in 1867, Canada became a separate country. And all the way up until today, Canada is still gaining more and more autonomy from Great Britain. For example, the King of England is still the King of Canada as well. Chapter 2. Haiti. When it comes to decolonization, Haiti doesn't fit into any category, because out of all the countries that had ever existed, Haiti is unique in that it's the only country to become independent through a slave revolt. All the way from the ancient Babylonians to today, out of the thousands and thousands of slave revolts, only one has ever succeeded in gaining independence: Haiti. So we will discuss this country separately from all the other ones because it's so unique. If you were a slave, one of the worst places to work was Haiti. Over 50% of all slaves died within the first year from yellow fever. The slave owners knew that half of all their slaves would die anyway, so they made no effort to keep them alive, because it was cheaper to buy new slaves than it was to keep current slaves alive for longer. And over the course of years, the slaves carefully planned a rebellion, inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution that all people deserve to be free. We will cover this more in an upcoming video about the transatlantic slave trade, but in short, most people in Europe were against slavery. So when the French people installed a new French government, one of the first things they demanded was an end to slavery and to give these freed slaves the right to become French citizens. And Haiti was a French colony. And if you're a slave living in Haiti, knowing you've likely had your last birthday, and the people who are oppressing you were fighting for some of the same freedoms as you, then you too might decide to pick up a weapon and fight. And so the revolt began on August 21st, 1791. The French and their allies would try for 12 years to take back the island, but eventually decided it just wasn't worth it and just agreed to give them independence. Haiti was officially granted independence on January 1st, 1804. Chapter 3. Dependency on the Homeland. The second major reason for decolonization was dependency on the homeland. When a country creates successful colonies, those colonies might want independence, and so the homeland finds a way to keep the colony dependent on them. In the case of Spain, it did so in two ways. The first was to limit free trade. A colony could only trade with the home country. For example, if you were a cocoa farmer in a Spanish colony, you could only sell that to Spain. And if your colony becomes independent, then you lose your one and only customer. The second way of keeping a colony dependent was to limit what they could produce. For example, if you wanted to build a machine in a Spanish colony, you were usually not allowed to. Instead, those machines had to be bought from Spain. This is why, even though cocoa was produced in the Americas, chocolate was invented in Europe. Because you need machines to make that sweet, sweet, delicious chocolate. And these two methods of making the colonies dependent on Spain worked for hundreds of years. The American colonies produced raw materials, while Spain provided manufactured goods, skilled labor, and education. But in the year 1807, Spain made a mistake that would break the system forever. They got invaded. Spain at the time had a king. The king had a crown prince. The crown prince didn't want to wait for his father to die, and they started a civil war. In this war, the crown prince won and became the new king. To the north of Spain was France, and France was ruled by Napoleon. Napoleon wanted Spain under French control, and so he forced the new king to give up the throne and stop being the king, so that Napoleon's brother could become the new ruler of Spain. And Spain now had a new civil war. On one side was Napoleon's brother, and on the other was the Spanish king. Both of them claimed to be the real king. So now imagine you're a Spanish colony in the Americas. Two ships have arrived. One of them is from Napoleon's brother, claiming to be their king. The other is from the old king, who is also claiming to be the true king. What do? If you pick the king that ends up losing the civil war, then you're in a lot of trouble. So with a 50% chance of making the wrong choice, the colonies simply decided not to make any choice at all. Each colony came up with an elaborate reason for why they couldn't support either side in the civil war. But this also meant they couldn't trade with Spain, because those trade ships would have to choose whether to go to a port owned by Napoleon's brother or owned by the old king of Spain, which meant you had to choose a side in order to trade. And so all of a sudden, the colonies could no longer depend on the homeland. For 7 years, the colonies had to survive without Spain. They had to find new markets to sell the products, find new countries to buy manufactured goods from, and set up new governments that could function without Spain. A good example of this is Mexico. Before Mexico became independent, it was called the Colony of New Spain. But for the sake of the video, we will use the names from after they became independent, because that's how most people know them today. So we'll just call it Mexico. When Mexico learned of the Civil War, the Mexican government had to choose which king they were going to be loyal to. The Mexican elite didn't want to choose out of fear that if they chose wrong, they would be executed by the other guy. So they came up with a smart scheme. The elites of Mexico worked for the king. If Spain can't decide who their king is, then that means the king can't rule his colonies. If the king can't rule his colonies, then the people will have to rule the colonies. And the people would meet regularly in town councils to discuss local politics. These town councils were organized by the Mexican elites, meaning the Mexican elites got all the power. This was a smart strategy. You claim power lies with the people and that you are working for the people. Then at the end of the Civil War, you can claim that you did nothing wrong because you were serving the people. And of course, the people were always totally 100% completely loyal to the guy who won the war, and therefore the elites did nothing wrong and can't be blamed for anything. And when those elites realized the war might take years, they called on the governor of Mexico to form a new colonial government. A government that could function on its own without a king in Spain looking over their shoulders all the time. The governor failed to come to an agreement between the different factions within the elites, and so one faction simply took all the power. They created a government able to function on its own, essentially removing its dependency on Spain entirely. This caused a civil war within Mexico between those who wanted to stay part of the Spanish Empire and those who wanted to become independent. And this story plays out all over Spanish-American colonies. The government needs to decide what to do about the Spanish Civil War, the elites can't agree what to do, and they end up in a civil war. Another good example of this is Paraguay. In 1811, the governor wanted to remain part of the Spanish Empire. The military disagreed, so they went to the government building, pointed 8 cannons at it, and suggested that the governor declare independence. Paraguay officially stated that they wanted to remain part of the empire, but that they were also going to be independent. Just like Mexico, Paraguay now had an excuse should the French ever try to take back control. We publicly stated that we wanted to remain part of the empire, therefore we are not traitors. From that moment, Paraguay began making alliances with other colonies, gathered weapons, and set up an independent government. The country technically became independent on May 14th, 1811. However, they wouldn't publish an official declaration of independence until 1842. Another good example is Chile, where the government wanted to remain part of the Spanish Empire, but a lot of regular people wanted independence. This also caused a civil war, the Spanish were also defeated here, and the country officially declared independence on September 18th, 1810, and defeated the Spanish 10 years later in 1820. The Spanish Civil War lasted between 1807 and 1814. when Napoleon was defeated. And between those years, almost every Spanish colony in the Americas had either declared independence or were fighting a war of independence. Spain wanted to get its colonies back under control and sent armies to the Americas. But the Americas are far away and Spain had just gotten out of a civil war. It simply couldn't supply the soldiers it sent to the Americas. Without supplies, those soldiers had to steal from the people. So imagine you're a Spanish citizen living in a colony. You live on your farm and you don't really care about independence. You just want to live a quiet life. Then one day a bunch of Spanish soldiers show up and steal everything you own.
If you or your family start going hungry, see how long you remain a law-abiding citizen.
The longer the Spanish stayed in the colonies, the more people hated Spain, so this Spanish army did a lot more for independence than it did for the Spanish Empire. A good example of this is Colombia, which declared independence on July 20th, 1810. The first Spanish soldiers arrived in 1814, and for 8 years the colony was turned into a bloodbath. The Colombians were relatively successful and wanted to unite with several other colonies to create a new country called Gran Colombia. And the Colombians would go to the nearby regions to fight the Spanish wherever they could, leaving hundreds of thousands of dead as the Spanish tried holding on to power. Venezuela joined the country for a few years, becoming independent as part of Gran Colombia on December 17, 1819. Ecuador joined the country on May 24, 1822, after successfully defeating the Spanish. For 12 years, the Spanish would fight a bloody war across the colonies, desperately trying to take back control. But in the end, Spain was too weak and their colonies too strong. And in 1826, Spain officially ended the war and accepted the independence of its colonies after a major defeat in Peru. Peru started their independence with a revolt in 1809. The governor of Peru turned against the Spanish and led several successful military campaigns. Peru officially declared independence on July 28, 1821, although the last Spanish soldiers were defeated in 1826. By the end, the Spanish simply didn't have enough troops to fight in all of its colonies. This is how the colony of Guatemala became independent. Just to clarify, the colony of Guatemala was a lot bigger than the modern-day country of Guatemala. The colony included modern-day countries such as Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. When this colony started demanding independence, the Spanish simply had no troops left to spare. Guatemala was seen as a lost cause, and this region officially declared independence on September 15, 1821. And the last Spanish colony to talk about is Argentina. Their story is pretty generic. They overthrew the government in 1810, this caused a civil war, and Argentina officially declared independence on July 9, 1816. How do you divide the world? According to Europeans, you draw straight lines on a map. And the biggest and straightest line of them all was over America. Spain and Portugal both wanted to colonize the new continent, but these two small countries couldn't decide on how to split these two massive continents. And so they asked the Pope for help, who then split up the world like this. Spain colonized one side and Portugal the other, and the Portuguese side is known today as Brazil. Brazil spent the first 3 centuries actually conquering this land from the Native Americans and building slave plantations. And it was dependent on Portugal for education of its nobility, military for protection, and manufactured goods for its colonists. This dependency changed with 2 major events. The first happened in the 18th century when they discovered gold in Brazil. With gold, the colony had enough money to buy whatever it wanted. Everybody wanted gold because at the time gold was money. And the second major event came from Napoleon. In 1807, France didn't just invade Spain, they also invaded Portugal, and the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil. For 6 years, Brazil was ruled from Brazil, and it could no longer rely on Portugal. Brazil started acting as an independent country. All the old colonial systems stopped working. So instead of sending gold to Portugal, that gold would now stay in Brazil, because that's where the king was after all. And a lot of Brazilians liked the idea of being ruled from Brazil instead of from Europe. When the war was over, the royal family eventually moved back to Portugal except the crown prince. He was to rule Brazil in order to gain experience for when he'd be king of the entire Portuguese empire. This was basically an internship. But as with all internships I've ever had, your boss is holding you back for no reason, and you know you would be a lot more successful working on your own without them constantly bothering you. How do you think I got this whole YouTube thing started? Thanks to shitty internships. But that's enough of a tangent. Back to decolonization. Well, the prince agreed with me, and so did most of the Brazilian elite. Now that Portugal tried to establish control over Brazil again, the Brazilians wanted independence. As discussed before, increasing control means increasing resistance. And so Brazil simply declared independence on September 7th, 1822, and made the Crown Prince of Portugal the Emperor of Brazil. And who could blame them? If I weren't into guys already, I certainly would be now. His full name was Dom Pedro I. What more could you want? Portugal did send an army, but by now Brazil was far too strong, and 2 years later, in 1824, Portugal was defeated. Chapter 4. Integration. Not all colonies become independent. There is a second option: integration, where a colony becomes part of the homeland and integrates into the political systems as an equal. The best way to assure a colony won't leave your empire is for the homeland to become dependent on the colony in the same way the colony depends on the homeland. To give an example, let's look at the USA. Most of its territories used to be colonies that were integrated into the US over time as new states. Some of these states are too poor to survive on their own, like for example Mississippi, and is dependent on the central government for aid. Others are too weak to survive on their own, like Alaska or Hawaii, that can easily be conquered if they were independent. And even if you're rich, like California, you still rely on the rest of the nation the way the rest of the nation relies on you. The USA provides skilled immigration, a vast pool of customers, and a powerful military to defend it, while California provides new technologies, access to the Pacific Ocean, and high-tech jobs and services. This creates a symbiotic relationship between the two parties until they become a single country. And so places like Alaska went from a Russian colony to a US colony to a US state. Whether you consider this decolonization or not, I'll leave that up to you. Chapter 5. Cannot decolonize. But there are also countries that are simply unable to become independent. For example, French Guyana is located right here in South America. This area is where the European Space Agency launches most of their rockets. But there are less than 300,000 people living here. Its people only earn about 20% of what the average French person earns, and only about half of all the people living in French Guyana were actually born there. Because of these issues, if they declare independence, they could lose almost half the population, leaving them with a country the size of Austria, with a population a quarter the size of Luxembourg. Good luck trying to defend that territory, and so French Guyana will remain French, because it simply cannot rule a country that big with a population that small. Let's compare this to a country with almost the same name, Guyana. Just to be clear, this land here is called Guyana and this land here is called French Guyana. Regular Guyana was a British colony. It was perfect for building plantations. It had a lot of rivers for irrigation that were big enough that a ship could travel from the ocean up the river to your plantations to store up on goods. And because this land was so useful, Spain and Great Britain had been fighting over it for centuries. When the Spanish colonies became independent, Venezuela tried taking this land for themselves. But they were always too afraid of Great Britain. Then, the colony became an independent country in 1966, and Venezuela invaded some of its territory and coastline to prevent Guyana from using those rivers for trade. Independence is nice, but also dangerous. Another very interesting case is that of Greenland. Greenland is huge, but it's almost impossible to live there. It's so difficult to live there that Greenland doesn't even have a capital city, because fewer than 20,000 people live in it, technically making it a capital town. I grew up in a tiny village with a higher population than the capital of Greenland. It doesn't even have enough people to defend itself, educate all of its citizens, or a strong economy. In short, Greenland cannot be independent. But one thing Greenland does have is a lot of resources. But it's also so cold up there that most people and machines can't work anymore. Only in the future, with global warming and advanced technologies, can humans access these resources. Everybody wants some of those future resources, and so everybody wants to be Greenland's sugar mommy. Some sign trade deals for Arctic research, some place radar stations in exchange for money, and others provide military protection. Because in the end, everybody is afraid that Greenland will side with their enemies, so they all try to remain friendly. Chapter 6. Political climate. Sometimes certain political actions are very popular. For example, when one country has a large protest, other countries tend to follow. Sometimes certain political alignments are very popular, such as how right-wing politics are currently ruling almost every country at the moment. But in the 1960s, decolonization was all the rage. But why though? For centuries, the European empires told the world that they were like a family, with each empire having people from all over the world working together. They said that Europe is enjoying an unprecedented time of wealth. Our people are happy and we're so fortunate in so many ways. We should try share this prosperity with the rest of the world. In our hands is the most successful civilization in history. The Western civilization. It is time we expanded it to share our greatness with the rest of the world through colonization. But this was a lie. Most people who were colonized did not want to be colonized. They wanted to decide for themselves how to live their own lives. And the Europeans started to realize this in the 20th century. There were a couple of prominent cases that changed people's minds. In India, the British committed multiple massacres against mostly peaceful Indians. After World War II, the Dutch slaughtered tens of thousands of people in Indonesia. In Vietnam, the French fought a long and painful war of independence. And in Algeria, the local population protested and rioted so much that even the French were intimidated. 4 bloody struggles of independence, and the Europeans lost each of them. And the people who grew up during World War II heard about these events in newspapers, radio, and on TV. People in France, the Netherlands, and Belgium had lived under German occupation and were now asked to do the same thing to other people in the colonies. To give a small example of this, my grandmother's sister grew up under German occupation. She told me once that one of her most traumatizing experiences was when one of her friends disappeared one day because she was Jewish, and she never found out what exactly happened to her, just that one day she never saw her friend again. Now, try to explain to someone like her that her taxpayer money should go towards doing those same things to people in the colonies because it helps them. People like her understand that empires don't bring prosperity. Empires only bring caskets filled with friends you wish were still alive. Political parties wanted to have their votes, so they argued that the European empires should stop spending so much money on people living on the other side of the world and instead spend that money on people in their own country. They argued that if the Homeland could sign a trade treaty with the colonies that are becoming independent, then there was no need to have colonies at all. That way the Homeland gets to keep all the benefits while getting rid of all the cost. These colonies won several elections, and by the 1960s, Europeans had basically decided that empires were bad and that colonies should become independent. And in the case of the Americas, these European countries were usually encouraged by the USA to decolonize. The reason for this is that the most powerful country in the Americas is the USA. So if the continent decolonizes, then they will likely fall under the influence of the United States, simply because the country is so incredibly powerful compared to the rest of the countries in the Americas. And so one by one, the last remaining colonies gained independence. Let's first talk about the British colonies. Even though Canada and the USA have been independent for over a century at this point, the British still had a lot of small colonies throughout Central America. Usually just a small collection of islands. When Great Britain decided to give these colonies independence, they decided to unite all these smaller colonies into a single large colony. and they called it the West Indies Federation. That way Great Britain would have a single powerful democracy in the Caribbean that would be their friend and ally. The only British colony that didn't join were the Bahamas, which gained independence on July 10th, 1973. And all the remaining island colonies went through a similar process of decolonization. Around World War II, a lot of them wanted democratic governments, and so the British allowed the people to vote for local elections with local politicians. When these colonies were united into the West Indies Federation, each colony had to choose its own regional government, and all the colonies together would vote for a single national government. And the plan was that this national government would eventually declare independence from Great Britain. But as many of you realize already, today there is no country called the West Indies Federation. The reason is that these colonies couldn't agree on even the most basic of things. For example, how much power should the central government have? How much taxes should every person pay? Or even what type of taxes people should pay? They couldn't even agree on a single trading policy. So one island might have completely different laws than another island. A product might be legal in one place but illegal in another. And this is no way to run a country. Jamaica was the largest and most powerful region within the West Indies Federation. They held a referendum in 1961 on whether Jamaica should become its own separate country. 54% voted in favor of Jamaica becoming independent. A year later, on August 6, 1962, Jamaica actually declared independence. This was followed by the rest of the Federation. Trinidad and Tobago became independent on August 31st, 1962. Grenada on February 7th, 1974, Dominica November 3rd, 1978, St. Lucia on February 22nd, 1979, St. Vincent and the Grenadines on October 27th of the same year, Belize on September 21st, 1981, Antigua and Barbuda on November 1st of the same year, and St. Kitts and Nevis on September 19th, 1983. And the last colonizer we will discuss is my own country of the Netherlands. My ancestors established a colony in Suriname, which is located here in South America. The Dutch Empire was already falling apart by the 1960s. The Dutch had already lost a costly war in Indonesia. Suriname was asking for independence as well, and the Dutch didn't want to fight another war in the jungle. So they decided that Suriname would slowly gain their independence. It started in 1954 when Suriname was allowed to govern its own internal politics. And these internal politicians convinced people that Suriname should become independent. In the 1973 election, the parties with the most votes were the ones who wanted independence. And so they began negotiating with the Dutch government, and on November 25th, 1975, Suriname officially became an independent country. And this is how the Americas decolonized. If you liked this video, then please give it a like and subscribe for more content.